Welcome to Galveston Unscripted. Hello and welcome to Galveston Unscripted. For this episode, I am excited and delighted to say that I had the opportunity to sit down with Lou Macbeth. Through years of research, she is able to trace her family roots back to 1830s Galveston, and we sat down to have a conversation about early Galvestonians, some of the Laffite crew left behind, and her great-great-grandparents' arrival in Galveston. Did you know that before the city of Galveston was founded, there was a small community made up of Texas Revolution veterans, immigrants from Maine, and Jean and Pierre Laffite's crew left behind? The community was called Saccrappa, and Lou talks about her research into the Saccrappa community. Lou has given many presentations on early Galveston history. You can almost view this conversation as an extension of the one I had with Dale Olson, one of the founders of the Laffite Society. I hope you enjoy this fun conversation I had with Lou Macbeth. And please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to wherever you find this podcast. Let's hop right into my conversation with Lou Macbeth.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Give me an audience and a microphone and I will talk.
Perfect.
Well, I'll start with Laffite because he was here from 1817 to 1820. And he left at the suggestion of the United States government. But when he left, there were some of his men who stayed, and I think that's one of the things that interested me. I did not know that my family was here so early until Heather was doing a project. She was probably in junior high, and there was no internet then. So we were at the library. We were at Rosenberg Library, and she's down there working on her paper. And I went up to the Texas History Center and just poked around, and I found my family in a very early city directory, which piqued my interest and started me on the trail to find out about my family. Well, Sheldon Graves, who is my ancestor, came here in 1840. Probably 1838, but I can't document 38, but his wife said that. That made me extremely interested in early Galveston history also. So I wondered if any of those people maybe had a connection with my family. So that's what started me on researching what I call the crew left behind. So the most favored captain that Laffite had was Jim Campbell. And everybody thought that Campbell would leave when Laffite left, but he didn't. He stayed. And I think that's because his wife, Mary, said, no, let's just stay here. She was also stayed with Laffite in his encampment for 3 years. So when she was interviewed as an elderly person after Jim was dead, she gave a lot of information about Laffite and his encampment, that has been very helpful to researchers. They lived on Virginia Point. Mm-hmm. Okay. There's a bayou over there called Campbell's Bayou that was named him. There's was a cemetery over there. Then it became a toxic waste dump. And the Galveston County Historical Society made arrangements to move all of those graves, and they are now in Forest Park East and are designated. And they identified every one of them.
About how many graves do you think?
There were probably about 30, I think. And it was just really interesting. That's another person that would be interesting for you to talk to is this woman that I heard her talk on moving the cemetery. So Jim Campbell, and the ironic thing is that Jim Campbell drowned after being on the sea all those years. He was on his way to Galveston from Virginia Point in a little skiff and hit some bad weather, and he drowned. So there were several others, and the earliest one we can really document is Stephen Churchill. And Stephen Churchill was a Laffite's bar pilot. And believe it or not, in 1845, he was deeded property in the East End, which is where Laffite's encampment was. And in the deed, it actually says, to Stephen Churchill, who was here at the time of Laffite. So that's really good documentation for a researcher. But it describes it as being so many feet from the Chinaberry tree. Well, I'm sure that Chinaberry tree is not there anymore. But anyway, that was Churchill. So the only one that I could really hook up to my family was Churchill, and I don't know if this is accurate or not, but Sheldon Smith was a blacksmith. And the first census that's printed with names is 1850. So I researched that and found Stephen Churchill living with a guy named Vandergift, who was a blacksmith. And he had a son named George, who was 7 years old, and his wife, and what's called a laborer, which was Stephen Churchill. So I couldn't find him in the 1860, but in 1870, there is a George Vandergift, 27 years old, which would be the same age as the child, living with my family. So is that a connection? I don't know, but it was kind of fun to research that. Okay, so that was Churchill. The other one that stayed was a guy by the name of James Lambert, and he was a butcher. He was a big guy, and there were those who said he was kind of ruthless. And one of the stories, which I can't document, but says that a young man working for him disobeyed what he told him to do, and he nailed him to the wall by the ear. All these wonderful stories that I find when I'm poking around.
The rough days of early Galveston.
Right. So he eventually became a port warden, but he left and went to Mobile, Alabama, and that's where he died. So let's see who we have. Oh, the most interesting one is Ben Dolliver, who was a character, and he just wore a little wraparound shorts, and he paid for he drank all the time. He paid for his drinks with doubloons, gold doubloons. So people always said, now I never saw him pay with a doubloon, but that's the story, that he knew where the money was. And so there were all sorts of stories about Ben Dolliver, but one of the things where they said he was ugly as sin and titched in the head because he had evidently been hit by a sword. He had a big scar across his head, but he was in the Battle of New Orleans, which is, a lot of these guys were in the Battle of New Orleans with Laffite. And he used to roam around the town. He slept on the beach, and anyway, he died in 1853. So we have Churchill, we have Campbell, we have Lambert, and then if you go over to the mainland, to Bolivar, there are a couple over there, but they weren't on the island. Charles Cronier lived a very long life to his 90s. He had been a cabin boy with Campbell and spilled something on Campbell's boots, and he boxed his ears, and he jumped off and started walking, and he ended up in Bolivar and stayed there. He has descendants here who I'm friends with. And then the other one was Burl Franks. His family was there. He even had a grant from the Mexican government for land over there. And he was considered to be Laffite's hunter, bringing meat to the camp. They left there, and I don't know when, in the 1840s sometimes, and I never found him again after he left. The family went up around Navasota someplace. And the other one was Andrew Roach, and he married Anson Taylor, who was, so people say, that Taylor Lake up around League City was named for him. And he married Anson Taylor's daughter, and he's very involved. He had 3 sons that died at the Alamo. So they were very involved in early Texas history. So that's basically the ones that I researched. There was another one called Nick the Greek. Well, how do you find someone named Nick the Greek?
Yeah, I don't know. That's got to be a tough one.
It was. And I reached out to some other researchers, and there was a article in the Galveston News, and it was about something not really involved with Nick the Greek, but it was about a father who had taken a child in a divorce, and the wife went over there to get the child back, and the driver of the vehicle that took her over there was called Nick the Greek, and his name was Zerma. Nick Zerma. And the article said he had been with Laffite, married a Karankawa Indian girl, and lived to be 100 years old and was a fisherman. Wow. Now, that's all in this newspaper, so how much of that is true, I don't know. But he was listed as being at the Greek Orthodox Church. Yeah, so, that's how they got involved in early Galveston history. But I know one of the things you want to know about is Saccrappa.
Yes, during my research of early Galveston history in Saccrappa, to be completely honest, I had never heard of it until maybe late last year. And it was one line in one of the scholarly articles I was reading, just one sentence, nothing more. So I would love to hear everything you know about Saccrappa.
A lot of my research came from, Hayes wrote a book called Galveston, A History, and he wrote it in the 1870s. Unfortunately, it was sent to the printer, and the print shop burned. Manuscript was lost, but they did have the plates. And I think probably in the 1970s, I think it was somebody from the University of Texas, they reprinted it, and I have a copy of that. It's two volumes. There's a lot of information about Saccrappa in there. That and other things. But here's the story of Saccrappa. There was a guy whose name was, and I've got to get it straight because I get him mixed up with Anson Taylor because his name is very similar.
Lou is referring to Amasa Turner, a Texas Revolution veteran and founder of Saccrappa.
And he was a colonel at San Jacinto. And Sam Houston sent him to Galveston with prisoners from San Jacinto because there was a fort on the east end of the island, and he brought them down here. And he liked Galveston, so he decided to bring his family here. Well, he brought his family here, and he worked to develop that land. Now, see, he came here like in the 1830s, 36, 37, 38, and he built a hotel. He called the Galveston Hotel. He built an ice house. He built an opera house. And there are articles about, the people that came and sang and put on plays and operas there. There was also a structure that was a masonry building that had been the Mexican custom house when it belonged to Mexico. And one of the references I said it was located near in the road where Laffite's fort had been. So it kind of gives us a reference of where everything was.
And that would have been around the community of Saccrappa. Those things that you're describing.
All the things I'm talking about are in Saccrappa. And Saccrappa really was kind of where UTMB is now. Mm-hmm. That's, and Laffite was, encampment was like around 14th Street and Harborside. Just a little aside, the society was trying to prove that was Laffite's, actually was his encampment, the location. And we did have archaeological digs there. But one of our members was an environmental attorney, and she had access and the availability to look at maps. So we had a map, an early map with an X. And she laid maps on top of maps on top of maps, and to the present time. And that X was within 700 feet of where Laffite's camp, where we think it is. So that's pretty close for somebody just to put X.
Yes, absolutely.
On a map.
On an early, 1800s map.
So that's where Saccrappa was. And it went up to about 17th Street. That was kind of the boundaries for it. So he built all these things, and he thought, I need to build a pier so that ships can come in and we can really develop this area. So he built a pier. Well, he had really bad luck because there were woodworms in the pier.
Oh, no.
They ate the whole pier. Well, it wasn't obviously going to work anyway because they did learn the water was not deep enough for the ships to come, that he wanted to come here. And the deepest water was around 21st, 22nd, 23rd, and that got developed. So, you think the city was founded in 1839. So the city was getting, developed. And here was Saccrappa down here at the other, with people living there. I don't think that Saccrappa disbanded. I think it kind of just came into the city. One of the funny stories that I have about Saccrappa is that several years, it was, I think, 1842 or something, there were a lot of veterans of the Battle of San Jacinto living there. So they decided they would have a reenactment. So they had the two sides, the cavalry and the soldiers, And in all this excitement, somebody's sword punctured one of the horses around his hip. And it was bleeding profusely. And the guy who was riding the horse rode around and around trying to get it to stop. And he ended up coming to his own house. And all this blood was spurting out. And his poor wife comes out and she starts wailing and carrying on that he's been injured. And the quote in the article said, "And so he said, 'Stop your lamentations, woman. You don't know the bit about war.' And with that, he took off and rode up and down the streets until the poor horse almost fell over. I don't need to tell you there was never a reenactment of the Sanderson.
No more Saccrappa-Sanderson reenactments.
There were, of course, in Galveston and in Saccrappa, there were always celebrations around the 21st of April. So that tradition continued. So that's kind of the story of Saccrappa. It was a lot like Galveston. I've read a lot of books on early Galveston. I have one that's called Yachting in the New World, Texas in the Gulf of Mexico, as I think is the subtitle. And it was an English woman who, they were on a yacht, and this is 1843. And they left England, and they went all through the Bahamas and the islands and came up to New Orleans. It's a wonderful book. She tells all about, the people and what was going on. And so then they came to Galveston, and she said so many great things about Galveston people, and that Texans and Galvestonians were friendly, they were helpful, they were easygoing. In fact, they were so easygoing, she said, that they didn't hurry to do anything. And if a storm or if something came in and knocked down the house, they just took the boards and slapped it together again. She said they really should do it with brick, but brick takes too long, and they're not interested in doing anything that takes time. So in one part, she says how wonderful the beach was, and she was in a carriage going down the sand. The sand was hard, and they were riding, and she said, nothing can stop you. Well, she said, they don't stop for anything except from the bullet from a rifle or a Bowie knife. That was the only thing that stopped a Galvestonian. And, sometimes the water would come up. But anyway, it's a very interesting book, but it was Galveston then, and to think that my great-great-grandmother was here, it's hard to imagine. It was muddy. There was no sanitation. Pigs ran wild. And there were a lot of dogs, and they got in fights with the pigs, and the pigs always kind of lost. That every pig she ever saw had its ears, bitten. But there were lots of deer. People hunted, and she told what they sold at the market. There were a lot of attorney offices. That's interesting. Still the same.
Yes.
There were lots of churches in 1843, and there were a lot of grog shops. So Galveston really hasn't changed a whole lot, except that our roads are now paved.
Yeah, that's really the only improvement we've had in the past 160, 70 years.
So anyway, that's kind of, there's some really neat books. Sheridan in 1840 wrote a book as he came into Galveston, and he did not like it in 1840. He said it looks like a piece of land that had an argument with the mainland and separated itself. But that, and then there are a series of letters at the Rosenberg Library that this gentleman found and published a book, and they are letters from a woman from Maine who came to Galveston in 1838. So I kind of think she was at Saccrappa, but she never says the word Saccrappa. They're very personal letters, what they were doing, how much things cost, about the weather, things like that, which was interesting to read. Her husband ended up being the manager of the Tremont Hotel.
Okay. Back to Saccrappa and the foundings of Saccrappa. So we've already touched on it was on the East End.
Yes.
It was kind of not really a competitor, but they were separate from Galveston, the city of Galveston.
Right.
So could you tell us a little bit about the origins and Why would these people come from Maine to Galveston, and why would they specifically set up on the East End?
Well, this woman that wrote all these letters was from Maine, so there may have been some connection with family up there. There was a woman from Westport, Maine, which is where the Saccrappa River ran. She came to a meeting of the Laffite Society, and I became friends with her. She sent me a map that showed the river that they named it after. There was a lot of good wood up there that they could bring here, a lot of hardwood. So that's the only. I have not found any documentation that says why the people from Maine came here. But, I think it's like anything else. A group gets together and they said, we've read about this and let's go down there. And then a group of them come down there, and that's how it starts. I really don't know why my great-great-grandfather came. He was in New York. He was a blacksmith in New York. So I'm just assuming he came here to get land. Yes. Because he did get a land grant. Unfortunately, it was in North Texas, and it was 1840, and the Indians were between him and land. They eventually sold it. But that's why I think about the people from Maine. That's all I know.
Okay. One thing I'd really like to ask, like, for instance, I asked Dale this. Why would people move from the East Coast or even other countries and come to Galveston, this little island that looked like it had an argument with the mainland? And why would they stick around here and stay here? Was it the freedom? Was it the lifestyle? Was it, yes, there's a port here or a growing port? Was it thriving? Or why would people stay?
I think it was a combination of those things. The way that you traveled in those days was by ship. And so people on the East Coast had access, either from the Carolinas or from New York, New Jersey, up that way. And they would sail, and they would come in either to New Orleans, or from New Orleans, they would come to Galveston, because that's where the port was. And they came here I think most of them came to get land. Some of them came to get away from money that they owed. They just kind of said, let's get out of here. Some of them had broke the law, and so they were coming to Texas. I mean, and Texas has kind of been known to be a very free,
yes,
for anybody to do anything. And that's pretty much how these people talked about Galveston that I talked to. They were very, lackadaisical, very free, and that's why they stayed here. The weather, she talks about the weather. And that if you came from New England or any place like that and you came to Texas, it was wonderful. They had the beach, they had the water, they had the balmy weather, they had access to deer and ducks and anything they wanted to eat. Believe it or not, there was a lot of agriculture toward the west end of the island, and so they had whatever they needed.
In the Saccrappa era, so late 1830s into the 1840s, in your research, did you find anything about the relations with the natives on the island, the Karankawa?
No, I think they were pretty much gone by then. There were no, and there were stories about Laffite's men having fights with the Karankawas. Some of our researchers have said that was not true, that he had a relationship with them and traded with them, and that it was James Long's men that had the fight.
What do you know about James and Jane Long?
Well, he was a freebooter. He came. He wanted filibuster. He wanted to come in, and he wanted to colonize Texas. And so her father was a doctor named Wilkinson, and he was also part of that group. And so she married James, and they had a child already. And they came as far as Bolivar, and he wanted to go. Nacogdoches was at that time another kind of hub. So he went to Nacogdoches and left her there while he went, and went to Mexico to negotiate. When he died there, of course, we had no internet, so Jane did not know what happened to James Long. So she stayed waiting for him She was pregnant. She had a slave, unfortunately, a slave with her, who was very young. I don't know how old he was, but anyway, he stayed with her and her little girl, and she used to run her petticoat up the flagpole so that they would think it was a flag, up and down, so that the Indians and everybody else would think, there's a fort over there. And then there was a cannon over there, and she would shoot the cannon every morning. So she gave the appearance of it being populated, which it really wasn't, not that early. And so one of the stories, of course, is that she was there when the bay froze over. And I think she settled up around Navasota or someplace around there and opened a hotel.
Okay.
Is where one of our members, Helen Moody, does a whole skit on. She dresses like her and everything.
Oh my gosh, that's great. Well, this is a topic that I would love to ask you about, is the role of women and strong women throughout Galveston and Bolivar history for Jane Long, but about early Galveston history and the role of women actually all the way up to today.
Well, I think you had to be a strong woman to live through the early days of Galveston. And my great-great-grandmother in her obituary, it says she was one of the first women in Galveston, and she loved to talk about the early days. How I wish I could talk to her. But I think you had to be strong. And if you go through history of what they did, after the 1900 storm, they were the ones who made sure that all the vegetation came back, the trees came back. Women, they could have just sat back and done nothing, but they didn't. They did that sort of thing. And they did other things. And, Galveston was occupied by the Union during the Civil War. And the men all went to fight, including my great-grandfather, who wasn't a soldier. He was on the Neptune, which was in the Battle of Galveston. Yes. He was an engineer on the Neptune. I think that Galveston women, in addition to after the flood, the 1900 storm and the grade raising and all of that, there have been other things. It was women, and one particular woman, who really worked to get the renovation of the Strand, the restoration, and get it going. They were going to knock down a building, and she and her buddies stood up there and hung out the windows while the wall was there and wouldn't let them take the building. So these were women who did this, not men. And so I think that there are lots of things through the history of Galveston where women, we eventually had a woman mayor, we had women on council, we had some of the earliest women in judicial appointments. I know I was raised to be a strong woman, and so as a Galvestonian, I wasn't the only one. Well, I think there's a lot of history in addition to the early history. Galveston has a fantastic history all the way through. I'm 85, 86 this summer, so I was fortunate to have been a part of lots of growth and events, not only locally but nationally. I was here for WW2 and, how we did that and the air raid wardens. So there's a whole lot of history in Galveston.
What are some of your memories growing up in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s here in Galveston, kind of after Galveston's heyday? So after, the 1950s, they shut down gambling here. And, what was it like growing up here?
It was wonderful to grow up. It was, we always say, and my friends agree, we graduated from high school in 1954. And we said to have grown up in Galveston and graduated that period of time, we would love for our children to have had that same opportunity. It was a very, I don't know how to state it. It was a very loving environment. We were very comfortable. We did not ever feel threatened by anything. And then after that, it became the 60s. I don't think Galveston is ever really impacted by what's going around in the world. If there is a depression, it goes on for a while, and finally it hits Galveston. There are other issues, like slavery, not a happy subject to talk about. But I have read several books on that, and there's one by a guy named, is it Forney? Something. Anyway, it's called Galveston on the Eve of Secession. He talks about how, of course, we didn't have the agriculture, so it was a different environment for slavery. It was mostly domestics, people who lived in the house and things like that. He says in his book that it wasn't uncommon for the domestic in the home to wear the mistress's shawl, and for her husband, who would be driving, they would be using the owner's carriage and his hat to go to church. Even in the 40s, which I know it was supposed to have been over, domestic work was about all that the black people who were not educated could do. So we always had somebody helping Mom, whether it was just to do the ironing or whatever. But there was never any prejudice. For some reason, it never occurred to us that the black kids who lived in the alley didn't go to school with us. We played with them. They were our friends. And Galveston was pretty much a melting pot anyway. We had Italian neighbors and Greek neighbors and, black neighbors and Mexican neighbors. And that's how Galveston was in my growing up. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe that as the world has gone on, those things have gotten more separated. But you wanted to know about my growing up? That's how it was.
Lou, thank you so much. This has been great, and I cannot wait to have you on again, and we will deep dive down some of these other topics, and I'm really excited to have you on and have your voice on this podcast.
Well, I thank you for the opportunity to tell about the place I love the most, which is Galveston.
Thank you, Lou. We'll talk soon. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Lou Macbeth. Thank you so much for listening to Galveston Unscripted. Please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. It means more than you know. And don't forget to follow us on social media. We are everywhere. Just check out that link in the description. Again, thank you so much for listening to Galveston Unscripted, and I'll see you next time. For historic resources or more information, check out the episode description.